Hey everybody. So here we are to 8.05. I know some fancy ass numbering, right? Emotion action tendencies. I'm going to ask you guys to develop your own emotion theory. It's like the last assignment in the class. This lecture I think is kind of clutch in approaching that. We're going to talk some theory, how it's developed, etc., what it means. So we're going to focus on emotional action tendencies here. Scouts from the Ethiopian contingent showing Buckeye pride at a scout jamboree in West Virginia a couple years ago. So there you go, OH. Thank you for that. So emotion, where the action is, well, let's begin by assuming then that emotion is a four-part process, and most people in the emotion game will kind of acknowledge this. That emotion comprises physiological arousal, cognitive interpretation of that arousal, and especially Schachter and Singer, as we saw. The subjective feelings, that is what wells up in us, but that could simply be differences in the affective stream depending on what flavor or theory you subscribe to. And then the behavioral expression. So emotions have evolved to help us respond to important situations to convey our intentions to others. Now, remember Darwin said that, hey, our emotions kind of just a vestigial issue, something left over. And some people may agree with Darwin. Others may say, no, I think they have a purpose, and I think they continue to evolve. That is, emotions do display my behavioral intention to others. That is, if I appear angry and aggressive, maybe someone will back down rather than me having to actually get physical with them. So it might facilitate interactions to a certain degree. Again, this is getting to a point where you're going to have to start fleshing out your own frickin' theory on this. Let us then take a look at the theory of basic emotions. We've seen this before. I just want to return to it in the context of this lecture. We're talking in terms of action readiness. That is emotions preparing us to do something, right? So, who else agrees? Well, Arnold says relation to action tendencies, right? Frieda and his folks say forms of action readiness, right? James said bodily involvement, and that could be something that's similar to it as well. And everyone who says hardwired might in fact have kind of a foot in this camp of action readiness. But let's look at some of the leading researchers in terms of emotion action tendencies, incorporating this into their theory or making it central to their theory. Elliott Smith, Dasher Keltner, Diane Mackey, Jennifer Lerner, more on Jennifer as we move through, Thierry Devos, and what are some general things that they found and have stated or incorporated into their emotion theories? Well, if we look at terms of action readiness, what does fear or disgust ready us to do? And that's to avoid. And disgust is an obvious one, right? We find something in the refrigerator that's been in there for like 16 years. We open it up, and the aroma is something to behold. And we rock back and notice the nostrils closed to limit the air coming into the nose. I increase my distance from the noxious substance, right? So we can see that emotions in this context are for doing, and disgust is for doing avoidance, avoiding the noxious stimuli. Fear leads to avoidance. That is, all else being equal, if I'm afraid, I want to avoid whatever is a threat. Are you a threat, Penelope? You're not a threat. You're a pretty girl. Yeah. What? I know. She doesn't have much of a meow, but she does speak quite a bit, if you will. Now, fear also leads to risk avoidance, and Devos, Mackey, and Smith in collaboration found that when they give gambling tasks, right, but they prime people with fear before they go into gamble, in that condition, those people gamble less. That is, the fear carries over to the gambling paradigm. Anger and happiness lead to approach, which I find ultimately ironic, because the folks that talk in terms of theory, well, there's positive versus negative emotions, and I say, yeah, but here is a positive and a negative emotion generally accepted, right? That those are negative and positive, but they both lead to approach. And that's like difficult. So I'm not so much, like I said before, on negative versus positive emotions. I'm a lot more of this kind of action tendency camp, that what's more important is emotions, are about responding, right? So anger only leads to approach based on one's appraisal of successful action. And we've talked about this in the past, and all the way back to Aristotle, right? Yeah, you may be angry, but you might not act on your anger if you're in a hierarchy and the person who's angering you is above you and can punish you for anger displays, right? Anger also leads to increased risk-taking, and in this case, Lerner and Kellner created a situation where they primed people to be angry, and they found that they took more gambling risks, right? Both approach and avoidance are subject to cultural norms, especially gender roles. And yeah, I got a self-citation or two. This one is a short one. What I'm going to say is we're going to look at it in the research section that the culture tells us what we're allowed to do when we experience a certain emotion. And to violate that is a source of discomfort, right? And we found even that there was a gender effect, but more on that later. So, what's so interesting? Penelope, what's so interesting? I love this picture. It just cracks me up, right? I want to live in this house where my dog, cat, and chickens are all looking and saying, "What are you doing in there? Right? Where are you going?" All right. So, intergroup emotion theory. This is a great book, right? So this is an edited volume, edited by Mackey and Smith, and this is prejudice and intergroup emotions, and we can really good examples of how emotion affects action tendencies, right? So mental representation of self becomes significantly tied to the in-group image. So in-group and me, we merge, we meld. Remember those terms from earlier lectures, right? Okay. Individual cognitive appraisal process expand to incorporate group level needs, desires, reactions. So in this country, what do? We see now that there are political forces that say, wow, there's so many foreigners coming to this country, they're going to destroy the traditional American life or way of life. And what they mean is they're going to destroy the way that white people like to live, typically, is where that's going. But notice, this becomes a personal concern that's internalized from what they perceive to be the group level concern. Right? So emotions that are a result of the appraisable are experienced on the individual on behalf of the group. So someone doesn't get a job and then they blame those foreigners are taking my job so I can't get a job, right? Appraisal and experience emotions follow predictable patterns. And this is something we do find that there's a lot of commonality across different situations. But emotion leads to given action tendencies. Action tendencies are related to experienced emotions, yet again in a predictable way. Now, other theories of emotion, and I'm going to toss one in here because I promised you guys we'll talk a little bit about this. The Circumplex Model. Check this out. Check how cool this is. Right? It's pretty. It's amazingly pretty with all these colors. So what do we see? Well, couple things I like about the Circumplex Model. You might find this useful in the assignment I told you about. How many basic emotions are there according to the Circumplex Model? Wait, you might say, well, who developed the Circumplex Model? And it's kind of a universal model that's been developed by a lot of theorists, kind of in combination. So let's go to basic emotions. And the Circumplex Model suggests 8 basic emotions, and here they are in this ring. So sadness, disgust, anger, anticipation, joy, trust, fear, and surprise constitute basic emotions. What were Ekman's 6th and then 7th basic emotion? Right? So we look at different theorists have different theories of what constitutes a basic emotion. Now, these are the basic emotions, right? But notice the Circumplex Model has 2 really awesome features. It allows emotions to be arrayed in intensity. And remember, we had an assignment on intensity variation. Annoyance, anger, and rage. So we can see going outward is increasingly lighter manifestations of the emotion. The internal, then, are the heaviest. Anticipation, well, vigilance versus interest, right? Now, so we can see that the Circumplex Model allows for different degrees of intensity of emotional experience, but then it does something probably just as tricky, if not trickier, and that is that it allows for blended emotions. And blended emotions are the combination of the 2. So let's pick on contempt, because according to the Circumplex Model, this is not a basic emotion. According to Ekman, whose inclusion for criteria inclusion is different, right? What we're going to say, though, contempt is a combination of disgust and anger. And you think, wow, That's pretty cool. That's relatively profound when you think about it. So you can maybe take this as a model. It's an interesting way to look at emotions. It's kind of a cognitively based model, no two ways about it, but certainly a theoretic model. Now, let us talk about basic emotion and basic tendency and get back to that kind of action tendency. Anger, all else being equal, approach. Fear, all else being equal, avoidance. But there are exceptions. Happiness, approach. Disgust, avoidance. Sadness, stationary. That is, let me just sit here and contemplate what's going on. Contempt, avoidance. Surprise, stationary. Let me take stock of the world, right? And trust would be approach. So, we've kind of taken some of the emotions here from the circumplex, added in a couple, and looked at the action tendencies. Now, can we also look at emotions as information? And I believe it was Gerald Clore used the term, no, it wasn't. Oh, shoot. Anyway, one of my favorite terms is affect as information. And it works both ways. Experienced emotions, felt emotions impel us to move, to remain still, right? As simple as appetitive, uncertain, or aversive responding. Either approach or avoidance or stationary. So we use our emotions as behavioral guides or information. But observed emotions act as cues to potential movement choices. Remember social referencing? That is, if the woman demonstrated the fear face to her infant, right, or whatever the fear face was, the kid, I don't want to move, right? But if the face was encouraging, then the kid crossed the virtual cliff. Especially informative as situational ambiguity increases, and the visual cliff was a great example of that. Yeah. What else do emotions do in this regard? Well, the perceptual effect and emotion. We find that some emotions tend to narrow perception, tend to focus us, and then remove distracting details. Anger. Man, when we get pissed off, we look at the target of our piss-offedness, right? That's an official term, right? We look at them, and we lose sight of everything that's around us. Fear often focuses our attention. Disgust, happiness are all focusing emotions that narrow perception. Broadening perception. Sadness, I got a question mark because I can probably tell a story that goes either way on that. Curiosity tends to broaden our perception, and everyone's favorite awe, right, tends to broaden perception. Now, what does it mean, and how do we test if someone's perception has been narrowed or broadened? Well, let me try this out. As quickly as you can, report to me what this figure is. Did you see it as a T, or did you see it as a bunch of H's? And notice there's a huge perceptual difference there depending on how you interpret it. Try this one. L's or F, right? Big picture or detailed picture. So there's ways in the laboratory, and I'm kind of hinting at our research methods kind of lecturette that's coming up. I better not call the research methods a lecturette. It's a full-blown big-ass lecture. This is a lecturette. So this is the way we can test the perceptual effects of emotion. Now, action, consequences of anger and fear, what do we know? Well, then let's kind of put all these elements together that I've just displayed. What do we know for anger? Tends to narrow one's attention. But the downside is then we have an incomplete survey of evidence or alternatives. So once we're angry, we're no longer probably open-minded. So we come down on someone, and often we do so in a way that's unfair. We usually have a diminished ability to perform cost-benefit analysis. That is, our prefrontal cortex is being devoted to other ideas rather than saying, hey, should I be angry or not, and what are the consequences of my anger? We have lessened ability to inhibit responses. So these are all kind of the downsides of anger, right? Now, the results of fear? Well, fear tends to cause us to repeat successful behaviors we found that were successful in the past. Fear is the destroyer of creativity. And if you take an org psych, one of the things that Dr. Deming said was, in an organization, job one is to drive out fear. Because people who are afraid don't want to take chances, and creativity means taking chances, right? So we tend to rely on past successful behavior and do an incomplete search of alternatives when we're afraid. Fear might lead to avoiding the problem altogether, right? Or concealing the problem so that others don't find out. And like I said, an incomplete search or test of alternative solutions. So in an organization, you can see how devastating the effect of fear is. Now, approach and avoidance consequences. Well, approach, avoidance, what do we know? In an approach mode, if we enter into an approach mode and we're experiencing approach level emotions, then often we have success or a sense of confidence, right? Sense of accomplishment. Avoidance might lead to a sense of relief. So when you're studying for a test, I'm going to approach this test. I'm going to kick ass on this test, kick ass and take names. I'm going to get a great score. I'm approaching the test with this opportunism, if you will, and seeing the test as a challenge. And then, but let's suppose that I'm avoiding the test. It's like I just gotta, God, please just let me get a C, just let me pass this test, right? And so what happens if I'm successful on the test? If I used an avoidance, a sense of relief, right? But if I approach the test and I do well, I'm successful, then I get a sense of accomplishment. So there's some choices we can make learning these ideas. That is, if I go through life avoiding, then at best I'm going to experience a sense of relief. If I go through life approaching, then I'll often be rewarded with a sense of accomplishment. Okay? Approach leads to new solutions. Right? It leads to openness to ideas. Avoidance tends to cause us to maintain existing systems. We're afraid to change because we don't know what the future is going to be like. Right? Approach is related to creativity. Right? Avoidance doesn't teach new behaviors, it simply highlights bad behaviors that might have failed us in the past. We have growth of organizational culture that's the result of approach, right? So, that's enough for now. We're going to return to action tendency conceptualization of emotion, right? In methods and approach, methods and emotions, prejudice and emotions, and relationships and emotions. So I hope to broaden this conversation, but remember, really clutch that we start thinking in terms of emotion theory and what our emotion theory will be for the end of course assignments, right? And also I want to introduce at this point in time, because I know you guys, I hope you guys are starting to work on your papers, so these are ideas that could probably be incorporated in many of your papers as well. So it's time to say goodbye for now. I promised you a short one. I know those are few and far between, so I guess we should relish that. And we're going to have a special goodbye from my good buddy, my familiar Cracker, who's not with us any longer, and I sure miss Cracker, but she sure was a whack job. So there you go, Cracker, and there wasn't much that Cracker wouldn't approach, let me put it that way. And that's the way she lived her life. So you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you next time.